At dinner, my sister proudly said, "This is my fiancé, an Army Ranger. A real hero." Then she smirked at me. "Unlike you and your safe little office job." But when the Ranger noticed the metal pin on my shirt, he stiffened, pulled her back, and said, "You have no idea who you're sitting with." The chandeliers above our family's dining table usually promised warmth, but tonight, their light felt cold on the crisp white tablecloth. I settled into my familiar chair, closest to the kitchen, a strategic escape route I'd honed over years of these gatherings. This evening, Veronica had orchestrated a dinner, a grand reveal of her new fiancé, Trevor. The triumphant gleam in her eyes as she entered, clutching his arm, was a familiar prelude to my discomfort. "Everyone, this is Trevor Walsh," she declared, her voice practically vibrating with proprietary pride, a spotlight on the broad-shouldered man at her side. "He's an Army Ranger, a real American hero who served 3 tours overseas." Trevor offered a polite smile, a brief, respectful nod to our parents. My mother, Audrey, immediately rose to shake his hand, while my father, Kenneth, offered his greeting from his seat. Trevor possessed that unmistakable bearing, close-cropped hair, sharp features, a posture molded by years of military discipline. "It's wonderful to meet you," Audrey chirped, her voice overly sweet. "Veronica has told us so much about you." I remained rooted in my chair, observing the scene with the practiced detachment I'd cultivated over countless family dinners. Veronica had always craved the spotlight, an insatiable need for validation that she was the most successful, the most accomplished, the most deserving of praise. Our parents, bless their hearts, had unwittingly fueled this dynamic since childhood, celebrating her every minor achievement with fanfare while my own accomplishments were often met with little more than a lukewarm nod. "And this is my sister," Veronica finally announced, her gaze flicking to me. Her smile, previously so radiant, sharpened, morphing into something subtly cruel. "She works at an office, you know. Just paperwork all day. Nothing dangerous or exciting like Trevor's job." The words hung in the air, heavy and challenging. I was accustomed to these subtle digs, these seemingly innocuous comments meticulously crafted to diminish my life choices while elevating her own. But tonight felt different. Tonight she had a distinguished audience she desperately wanted to impress, and I was, as always, the convenient target. "Unlike you and your safe little office work," Veronica continued, her smirk widening as she possessively squeezed Trevor's arm. "Trevor puts his life on the line for this country. He's a genuine hero." I met her gaze steadily, my face a mask, refusing to betray the slow burn of irritation coiling beneath my calm exterior. Years of practice had taught me this stoicism. Giving her the satisfaction of seeing me upset would only embolden her attacks. Then an imperceptible shift. Trevor, who had been listening with polite, if somewhat distant, interest, stiffened beside Veronica. His eyes, sharp and assessing, swept the room, then landed on me. Specifically on the small, unassuming metal pin fastened to my collar. Most wouldn't notice it, or if they did, wouldn't understand its quiet significance. Less than an inch across, its simple design held profound weight for those who knew. Trevor's face went rigid. The color seemed to drain from his complexion, and he straightened, if that were even possible. His hand released Veronica's arm, and he took a half-step back, his posture now taut with a different kind of discipline. "Veronica," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the dinner chatter with an unexpected warning that silenced everyone at the table. "Stop talking." My sister blinked, her triumphant expression faltering, a flicker of confusion clouding her features. "What?" "I'm just saying, you don't know who you're sitting with," Trevor interrupted, his gaze never leaving my pin. He turned to face Veronica fully, his expression now stark, devoid of the earlier politeness. "You have no idea what you're talking about." A stunned silence enveloped the room. Audrey and Kenneth exchanged bewildered glances, while Veronica's mouth opened and closed without producing a sound. I remained motionless, a silent observer of the spectacle, maintaining the same calm detachment I'd perfected throughout the evening. Trevor drew a deep breath, then looked directly at me. "Ma'am," he said, his voice imbued with a rare, profound respect reserved for specific military contexts. May I ask where you earned that pin? I had options. I could have deflected, changed the subject, or offered some glib, self-deprecating joke. But Veronica's smirk, that smug, self-satisfied expression she'd worn while belittling my work, flashed through my mind. Afghanistan, I replied, my voice steady, devoid of inflection. My team operated out of several forward operating bases between 2012 and 2018. Veronica's face went pale. Your team? She choked out. I was a combat intelligence analyst. I explained, my tone strictly matter-of-fact. I worked directly with Special Operations Forces, including Army Rangers, to identify and track high-value targets. The PIN recognizes service members and civilians who've worked in active combat zones under hostile fire conditions. Trevor nodded slowly, his respect now palpable, a silent acknowledgement. Which bases? He asked. Primarily FOB Shera and FOB Salerno, I said, though I rotated through several others depending on mission requirements. I was at Shera, Trevor said quietly, a distant look in his eyes. 2013 to 2014. The intelligence work that came through our operations center saved lives. Saved my life specifically, during an ambush outside Khost. Kenneth, our father, finally found his voice, a tremor in his question. You were in Afghanistan, in combat zones, for 6 years? I was, I confirmed. I couldn't discuss the details because most of my work was classified. It still is, actually. I'm only mentioning the basics now because Trevor recognized the PIN and asked directly. Audrey's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. We had no idea. You never said anything. I wasn't allowed to say anything, I explained. My clearance level prohibited discussing my assignments with anyone who didn't have need-to-know access. That included family members. Veronica remained frozen, her earlier confidence utterly shattered. The woman who'd spent the evening gleefully mocking my safe little office work now looked as if she desperately wished the floor would swallow her whole. The paperwork you do, Trevor said to me, his tone now laced with apology. Is that still related to intelligence work? I explained that I transitioned to a contractor position after my government service, analyzing threat assessments and providing strategic recommendations for security operations. It's technically office-based, I clarified, but it's a direct continuation of what I did in the field. Trevor then turned to Veronica, his expression a complex mix of disappointment and disbelief. You've been insulting your sister's service, he stated, his voice low and steady. Belittling work that people like me depend on to stay alive. I didn't know, Veronica stammered, her voice thin. She never told us. How was I supposed to know? Perhaps, I suggested quietly, by not assuming. You know everything about someone's life. Perhaps by not using my career as ammunition to make yourself feel superior. The remainder of the dinner passed in an excruciating, awkward silence. Audrey made several valiant but futile attempts to restart conversation, inquiring about Trevor's service and my experiences, but the damage was irreparable. Veronica barely touched her food, her earlier triumphant mood utterly destroyed. As dessert was served, Trevor leaned towards me, his voice hushed. I want to apologize for not stepping in sooner. I should have said something the moment she started making those comments. You didn't know the situation, I replied, a small, weary smile playing on my lips. And you certainly didn't expect your fiancé's sister to be someone with my background. Still, he said firmly, his gaze unwavering, the way she spoke to you was disrespectful, regardless of your service record. Nobody deserves to be talked down to like that, especially at a family dinner. I appreciated his words, truly. But I had learned long ago not to expect different behavior from Veronica. Our entire childhood had been a relentless competition, her tireless effort to prove she was smarter, better, more deserving of our parents' affection. This dinner was simply another, more public, manifestation of that lifelong pattern. What truly surprised me, however, happened after everyone had left that evening. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Trevor. I need to talk to you about Veronica, he said without preamble. Can we meet for coffee? We met at a cafe downtown, a neutral territory far removed from family and its complicated history. Trevor arrived precisely on time, that military precision still evident in his bearing. I wanted to ask you about your sister, he began, once we'd settled into a secluded corner booth. About how long she's been treating you this way. I paused, considering how to condense decades into a few sentences. As long as I can remember, I finally said. Why? Because the woman I've been dating for 8 months apparently has no problem publicly humiliating her own sister, Trevor said bluntly, his eyes dark with a dawning realization. And if she's willing to do that to family, I need to understand what I'm getting into. Over the next hour, the stories poured out of me, a flood of memories I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. Perhaps it was because I'd never had anyone genuinely interested in hearing them before. I started with childhood, with being 7 years old and winning the regional science fair. Veronica, then 12, was already the golden child, excelling at everything. My project, an ambitious study of local water quality, earned me first place. Veronica's response? To tell our parents I'd only won because the competition was weak, and that her own 7-year-old project had been far more sophisticated. My achievement, which had filled me with such pride, was instantly tainted, diminished by her desperate need to maintain her position as the superior sister. Your parents believed her? Trevor asked, his brow furrowed. They didn't contradict her? They didn't, I said, which felt like the same thing to a 7-year-old. I spoke of high school, of making the varsity debate team as a sophomore, an unusual accomplishment. Veronica, already in college, called home to declare that debate had never interested her because it was just arguing for argument's sake, not real intellectual work. The pattern repeated with every milestone. My full scholarship to a prestigious university? Veronica implied I was less respectable because I didn't pay my own way. My summa cum laude graduation? Grades didn't matter as much as real-world experience, of which she, naturally, had more. She couldn't just be happy for you, Trevor observed, a sad understanding in his voice. Everything had to be reframed to maintain her position. Exactly, I confirmed. And the worst part was how our parents facilitated it. They never told her to stop. Never suggested that, just maybe, we could both be successful without it being a competition. I recounted a Thanksgiving when I announced my acceptance into a graduate program for international security studies. Veronica rolled her eyes, quipping, "Must be nice to stay in school forever instead of joining the real world." My father had chuckled, as if it were a clever observation, not a cutting dismissal. That graduate program, though, led directly to my recruitment by a defense contractor placing analysts in combat zones. The work was precisely what I'd trained for, what I wanted. But I couldn't share details with my family, not the location, not the nature of the job. That must have been difficult, Trevor said. Leaving for a combat zone without being able to explain why it was necessary. The clearance requirements were absolute, I replied. I told them I'd gotten a government position requiring extensive travel, which was technically true. Veronica, predictably, immediately began joking about me being a paper pusher, destined for a basement office. The teasing continued every time I came home on leave. She'd ask pointed questions about my work, knowing full well I couldn't answer, then use my silence as proof that my job must be utterly unimportant. She'd then launch into detailed descriptions of her marketing career, client presentations, successful campaigns, making sure everyone understood her visible, impressive, recognized work. Meanwhile, Trevor interjected quietly, "You were operating in one of the most dangerous places on Earth." Meanwhile, I agreed. I was tracking insurgent networks, providing intelligence that kept people like you alive. But I couldn't say that. I couldn't defend myself or correct the narrative she was diligently building. I remembered returning from a particularly brutal 8-month deployment. 18-hour days in a plywood operations center, temperatures routinely over 100 degrees. I'd coordinated intelligence for dozens of missions, including several high-value target captures, and witnessed things I could never discuss, stresses that would take years to process. I came home exhausted, a bitter weight settling deep in my soul. My parents had organized a family dinner. Veronica arrived with her then-boyfriend, eager to announce their new apartment purchase. She monopolized the entire dinner, talking about real estate markets and investment opportunities. Every time the conversation threatened to shift towards me, towards asking how I was doing, she'd skillfully redirect it back to herself. By the end of the night, I'd probably spoken 10 words. "Did your parents notice?" Trevor asked. "If they did, they didn't intervene," I replied. That was always the pattern. Veronica took up all the space in any room, and everyone just let her, because it was easier than dealing with the fallout if you challenged her. Another incident years later, when I was home between contracts. I casually mentioned considering another overseas deployment. Veronica immediately launched into a tirade about some people never learning to settle down and build a real life. "She made it sound like you were running away from something," Trevor said. "She made it sound like I was a perpetual child who couldn't handle adult responsibilities," I corrected, the memory still stinging. Never mind that I'd been handling responsibilities most people couldn't imagine, building a career doing work that profoundly mattered. In her narrative, I was always the lesser sibling, the one who hadn't figured life out yet. This dynamic, I explained, had bled into other relationships. Dates got frustrated by my inability to discuss my work. Friendships faded because I couldn't explain my months-long disappearances and limited communication. The security requirements of my job had created an isolation that Veronica then weaponized, using it as proof of my inadequacy. She'd point out I wasn't married, had no children, owned no property, all the traditional markers of success she'd achieved. My different choices, my different priorities, simply didn't matter to her. There was one correct way to live, and she was living it while I, in her eyes, was failing. Trevor's jaw tightened as I spoke. I watched him process not just the content of my words, but their stark implications for his own relationship. "When did you realize it wasn't going to change?" he asked. "Probably around year 4 of my service in Afghanistan," I admitted. "I came home on leave, and she was there with yet another boyfriend, talking wedding plans. She asked what I'd been doing, and when I gave my standard vague response about classified work, she laughed. 'Still playing spy games, huh? When are you going to get a real job?' That moment had crystallized everything. Veronica wasn't going to suddenly develop empathy or understanding. She wasn't going to wake up and realize she'd been cruel. Her identity was too inextricably linked to being superior, to being the successful one, to ever allow space for acknowledging my actual accomplishments. So, I stopped expecting anything different," I continued. "I stopped hoping she'd change, or that my parents would finally see the pattern. I just accepted it as the reality of my family dynamic and focused on the work that mattered to me." I told Trevor about the pin, the one he'd recognized at dinner. It had been awarded during a ceremony at Bagram Airfield, attended by military leadership and intelligence personnel who profoundly understood its significance. The citation was classified, but it acknowledged service under hostile fire and contributions to successful combat operations. "I wore it home once," I said. Veronica asked what it was, and I said it was a service recognition. She barely glanced at it before changing the subject back to herself. She had no idea what it represented, no curiosity about its true meaning. It was just another detail about me not worth her attention. Trevor sat quietly, absorbing every word. I could see the conflict warring across his face. The man who'd been captivated by Veronica's charm now grappling with the stark evidence of who she was beneath that polished surface. "The woman I've been dating," he finally said, his voice strained, "isn't who I thought she was. She's good at presenting a certain image," I replied. "She always has been. But underneath, there's this insatiable need to be the best, the most important, the most worthy of attention. And anyone who threatens that position becomes a target." I explained how this extended beyond just our sibling dynamic. Veronica had a history of fractured friendships, soured professional relationships, patterns repeating with different people but the same outcome. Yet, she never examined her own role. There was always an explanation that absolved her, always someone else to blame. And your parents never challenged this? Trevor asked. They enabled it, I said. Every time someone called out her behavior, they defended her. Every time she faced consequences, they buffered her from them. They created an environment where she never had to examine herself or grow beyond her worst impulses. Trevor listened, his expression growing increasingly troubled. When I finished, he sat back, exhaled slowly, a heavy weight lifting. After that dinner, he admitted, I started paying attention to how she talks about other people. Her coworkers, her friends, even strangers. There's always this undercurrent of judgment, this need to position herself above everyone else. I'd overlooked it before, written it off as confidence or ambition. But now you're seeing it differently. I finished for him. Now I'm seeing who she really is. He confirmed, his gaze meeting mine. And I'm realizing I don't want to marry someone who treats people that way, especially people she's supposed to love. 2 weeks later, Trevor broke off the engagement. Veronica's call came immediately, her voice vibrating with a raw, unbridled fury. This is your fault, she hissed, the accusation sharp enough to cut. You turned him against me. You couldn't stand that I'd found someone who made me happy. I didn't turn anyone against you, I replied calmly, my voice steady against her storm. I had one conversation with Trevor, where he asked questions, and I answered honestly. What he did with that information was his choice. You're lying. You must have said something terrible about me. You sabotaged my relationship because you're jealous. The accusation would have wounded me once, back when I still harbored the naive belief that I could earn my sister's love through infinite patience and understanding. But years of her relentless behavior had taught me a stark truth. Veronica's capacity for self-reflection was virtually non-existent. Nothing was ever her fault. Someone else was always, irrevocably, to blame for her problems. Veronica, I said quietly, my voice firm despite the weariness it carried. Trevor saw exactly who you are. He watched you belittle me at dinner. He heard the contempt in your voice when you talked about my work. He didn't need me to tell him anything he hadn't already witnessed. You think you're so special because you were in Afghanistan? She spat, venom lacing her words. You think that makes you better than everyone else? I've never thought I was better than anyone. I countered, my resolve unbroken. That's always been your obsession, not mine. You're the one who needs to constantly prove your superiority. I just wanted to do work that mattered and be left alone. She hung up on me. I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me, however, was the phone call from my mother the following evening. Audrey's voice was hesitant, almost nervous, when she asked if we could meet for lunch. We sat across from each other at a small, discreet restaurant, and for several minutes, Audrey simply studied my face, as if seeing me, truly seeing me, for the very first time. Your father and I have been talking, she finally said, her voice soft. About the dinner. About your service. About how we've treated you compared to your sister. I waited, a cautious apprehension coiling in my stomach, unsure where this unprecedented conversation was heading. We failed you, Audrey continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. We got so caught up in Veronica's accomplishments, her insatiable need for constant validation, that we never properly acknowledged what you were achieving. We never asked the right questions about your work or your life. You couldn't have known about Afghanistan, I pointed out gently. I wasn't allowed to tell you. But we could have paid more attention to who you were becoming, she insisted, a new firmness in her tone. We could have noticed that you were doing something important, even if we didn't know the specifics. Instead, we let Veronica's narrative about you become our narrative, too. The admission caught me completely off guard. I'd long ago accepted that my parents would always favor Veronica, always prioritize her feelings and needs above mine. Hearing Audrey acknowledge that ingrained pattern felt utterly surreal. Your sister has been calling us nonstop since Trevor ended things. Audrey went on. She's been saying terrible things about you, demanding we take her side. And for the first time, your father and I realized we were hearing the same story we'd heard dozens of times before. What story? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. That nothing is ever her responsibility. Audrey explained. That her problems are always someone else's fault. That the world is unfair to her, specifically. We'd always accepted that narrative because it was easier than challenging her. But watching her try to blame you for the consequences of her own behavior finally opened our eyes. I didn't know how to respond. This conversation felt like a vindication for decades of being overlooked and dismissed. But it also felt too late. The damage had already been done. I'd already learned to expect nothing from my family, already built protective walls that wouldn't easily come down. I'm not telling you this because I expect forgiveness, Audrey said, reaching across the table to gently touch my hand. I'm telling you because you deserve to know we understand now. We see what we did wrong, and we're going to do better. What does that mean practically? I asked, skepticism still coloring my tone. It means we're not going to enable Veronica's behavior anymore, she replied firmly. It means we're going to hold her accountable when she treats people badly. And it means we're going to make a genuine effort to know you, to understand your life, to be the parents you deserved all along. I wanted to believe her. Some deep, vulnerable part of me, the child who had craved parental approval throughout her entire life, desperately wanted to accept these words at face value. But another part, the protective, battle-hardened adult, remained skeptical, unwilling to make myself vulnerable to more disappointment. I appreciate you saying that, I told her carefully. But I need to see actions, not just hear promises. Fair enough. Audrey agreed, her gaze unwavering. We'll prove it through how we show up from now on. In the following months, my parents made consistent, genuine efforts to bridge the chasm that had long existed between us. Kenneth, surprisingly, began asking detailed questions about my work, respecting the boundaries of what I could discuss. Audrey initiated regular one-on-one lunches, free from any mention of Veronica or the expectation that I would somehow fix the family dynamics. Veronica, meanwhile, spiraled. Without the familiar buffer of our parents running interference, without the safety net of knowing they'd always take her side, she found herself confronting the unvarnished consequences of her behavior. Friends began to distance themselves, weary of her consistent pattern of subtle put-downs. Professional relationships suffered as colleagues grew tired of her relentless need to be recognized as superior. The first major incident occurred at her workplace, about 2 months after Trevor ended their engagement. Veronica had been at a prominent marketing firm for nearly 5 years, steadily climbing the ranks through a combination of genuine talent and aggressive self-promotion. She excelled at presenting ideas, making herself visible to leadership, and critically claiming credit for successful campaigns. But her habit of dismissing her colleagues' contributions finally caught up with her. A junior team member, a bright woman named Holly, had designed an innovative social media strategy for a major client. The campaign went viral, generating millions of impressions and significant revenue. During the celebratory presentation, Veronica stood up and boldly took credit, suggesting Holly's execution had merely followed her superior vision. Holly, who had apparently reached her limit, politely but firmly corrected the record, pulling up email timestamps that showed her original pitch, concepts Veronica had initially criticized. Other team members corroborated Holly's account, and suddenly, the leadership team was forced to confront a pattern they had long overlooked. Audrey recounted this to me during one of our lunches. Your sister called me crying, she said, her voice heavy. She said her coworkers had ganged up on her, that they were jealous and trying to sabotage her reputation. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her that maybe she needed to think about why this keeps happening. Audrey replied, a rare steel in her tone. About why people keep pushing back against her. It didn't go well. She accused me of siding with strangers over my own daughter. The conversation, Audrey admitted, escalated into a full-blown argument, unlike any they'd ever had. Audrey finally voiced the concerns she'd privately harbored for years about Veronica's treatment of me, her tendency to blame others, her utter inability to take responsibility for her own actions. She hung up on me, Audrey said, and she didn't call back for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, more of Veronica's relationships deteriorated. Her close friend Madison, her college roommate, reached a breaking point after Veronica made a dismissive comment about Madison's engagement ring, suggesting it was modest and her fiancé should have saved longer. Madison, according to Audrey, responded by detailing years of similar backhanded compliments and subtle put-downs that had slowly eroded their friendship. She told Veronica she was tired of feeling diminished, tired of having her happiness qualified and judged. The friendship ended via text message. I learned about these developments through my parents, never directly from Veronica. She had stopped speaking to me entirely after blaming me for Trevor. As her other relationships crumbled, that silence deepened into something more permanent. She thinks you've poisoned everyone against her, Kenneth told me during a phone call. She's convinced you're orchestrating some kind of campaign to destroy her life. I barely interacted with anyone in her circle. I pointed out, exasperated. I haven't spoken to her friends or colleagues. How exactly would I be orchestrating anything? Logic isn't really part of her thinking right now, Kenneth admitted. She needs someone to blame. And you're the convenient target. I asked him how he and Audrey were handling the situation, whether they were sliding back into old patterns of defending Veronica regardless of the circumstances. We're trying to do what we told you we'd do, Kenneth said. We're not enabling her anymore. When she calls looking for validation, we're asking her to consider her own role in these situations. It's not going well. Honestly, she's angry at us too. This shift was confirmed at a family gathering for Audrey's birthday, about 3 months after the infamous dinner. Veronica arrived late, barely acknowledged anyone, and spent most of the evening glued to her phone. When Audrey gently asked if she was all right, Veronica snapped that she was fine, clearly. Why did everyone keep asking her that? The tension in the room was palpable. I watched this woman, who had once commanded every conversation, who'd filled every space with her personality and demands for attention, now sitting isolated in a corner of our parents' living room. A part of me felt a quiet vindication. A larger part just felt profoundly sad that it had come to this. Later that evening, after most guests had left, Veronica cornered me in the kitchen. Her face was flushed, whether from wine or raw emotion, I couldn't tell. Are you happy now? She demanded, her voice a low hiss, careful to ensure our parents couldn't hear from the next room. Is this what you wanted? Everything falling apart for me? I never wanted anything to fall apart for you, I replied honestly, my voice even. I just wanted you to stop treating me like I was less than you. I never treated you that way, she insisted, and I realized with startling clarity that she genuinely believed this. In Veronica's mind, her constant comparisons and dismissive comments had been normal sibling dynamics, perhaps even motivational. She couldn't see the cruelty in her actions because she never examined them from anyone's perspective but her own. Veronica, I said carefully, at that dinner with Trevor, you mocked my work in front of everyone. You called it safe and boring. You implied that what I do doesn't matter. You've been doing versions of that my entire life. I was just being honest, she protested. I was just saying that Trevor's job was dangerous and yours wasn't. That's not an insult. It's just a fact. Except it wasn't a fact, I reminded her gently. And even if it had been, there was no reason to frame it as a comparison designed to make me look smaller. You could have celebrated Trevor's service without putting me down. But you didn't, because putting me down is what you do. Her expression hardened, a familiar mask of righteous indignation. Everyone thinks you're so noble now, so heroic. Poor, underappreciated sister who was serving her country while mean Veronica was at home being successful. But you know what? You chose not to tell anyone what you were doing. You chose that secrecy. So don't blame me for not knowing something you deliberately hid. She had a point, an undeniable flicker of truth. I could acknowledge that my security clearances had required secrecy, and that secrecy had inadvertently provided cover for her narrative about me. Still, Her argument ignored the fundamental issue. The secrecy doesn't excuse how you treated me, I said. Even if I'd been working a boring office job, even if every assumption you made had been accurate, that wouldn't have justified the constant put-downs. The problem isn't what you didn't know. The problem is how you choose to treat people. Veronica's eyes welled with tears, and for a fleeting moment, I thought perhaps something had broken through. Then she shook her head, dismissing the thought. You've turned everyone against me. Mom, Dad, Trevor, all of it. You've somehow convinced them that I'm this terrible person when all I've ever done is be honest. I didn't turn anyone against you, I said tiredly, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. People saw your behavior and made their own decisions. I didn't have to convince Trevor of anything. He watched you belittle me at dinner and recognized what that said about your character. Mom and Dad started paying attention to patterns they'd ignored for years. Your coworkers and friends got tired of being treated as lesser than you. None of that is my doing. She left the kitchen without another word, and I heard the front door slam moments later. Audrey appeared in the doorway, concern etched across her features. What happened? Reality happened, I said. She's still not ready to face it. Over the following weeks, Audrey informed me that Veronica had started therapy. Apparently, her supervisor at work had suggested it as part of a performance improvement plan, framing it as support for stress management, but clearly hoping it might address some of the deeper interpersonal issues affecting her team dynamics. Do you think therapy will help her? Audrey asked during one of our lunches. Only if she's willing to be honest with the therapist, I replied. And more importantly, honest with herself. If she goes in determined to prove that everyone else is wrong and she's the victim, then no, therapy won't help at all. I didn't harbor high hopes, not given Veronica's extensive track record of deflecting responsibility. But I also recognized that people could change if they genuinely wanted to, if they were willing to do the difficult work of examining their own behavior and its impact on others. Months passed. I settled deeper into my civilian contractor work, finding profound satisfaction in applying my skills to threat analysis, now without the immediate stress of operating in active combat zones. My relationship with my parents continued its slow, steady improvement through consistent, honest communication. Kenneth, truly engaged for the first time, began asking about my day-to-day life, showing genuine interest in the person I was, rather than the person he'd assumed I should be. Trevor and I maintained our friendship, meeting occasionally for coffee or lunch. He had started dating someone new, a teacher he'd met through mutual friends, and seemed genuinely happy. How are you doing with everything that happened? I asked him during one of these meetups. Honestly? Relieved, he admitted. I keep thinking about what my life would have been like if I'd married her. If that dinner hadn't happened, if I hadn't seen her true character, I'd be tied to someone who fundamentally doesn't respect other people. That's a terrifying thought. He paused, then continued, a somber note entering his voice. I also keep thinking about all the red flags I ignored. The way she talked about her coworkers, how she'd get irritated if a server made a mistake, small moments I dismissed as stress or bad days. But they weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns I chose not to see because I was focused on who I wanted her to be, rather than who she actually was. She blamed me for all of it, naturally. According to Veronica's version of events, I had orchestrated an elaborate campaign to destroy her life. The reality was far simpler. People were finally seeing what had always been there, unobscured by family loyalty or social obligation. Trevor and I stayed in touch, though never romantically. We both recognized that the unusual circumstances of our meeting made any romantic relationship inappropriate, but we developed a friendship based on mutual respect and a shared understanding of military culture. How's your sister doing? He asked during one of our occasional coffee meetups. Still angry at me, I replied, a wry smile touching my lips. Still convinced I'm responsible for ruining her engagement. Does that bother you? He inquired. I considered the question. It would have once. But I'd accepted that Veronica is who she is. She's never going to look inward and recognize her own role in her problems. She's always going to need someone else to blame. That's got to be exhausting for everyone around her, Trevor observed. It is, I agreed. Which is why people keep leaving. The conversation reminded me of something I'd learned during my years in intelligence work. Some people never change because they genuinely cannot see beyond their own perspective. They are so committed to their narrative about themselves and the world that any contradicting information is rejected or reframed to fit existing beliefs. Veronica was one of those people. She had spent so long defining herself as superior, as more deserving, that accepting responsibility for her own failures would require dismantling her entire self-concept. It was easier to maintain the delusion, even if that delusion left her increasingly isolated. My relationship with my parents continued to improve, slowly but surely. They began including me in family decisions, seeking my opinion on matters they previously handled without my input. Kenneth even started sharing stories from his own father's military service, conversations we never had before because Veronica had always dominated discussions. I wish I'd understood sooner, Kenneth said during one of these talks, his voice tinged with regret. I wish I'd recognized what you were doing and been proud of you out loud. You can be proud now, I told him, a quiet warmth spreading through me. That counts for something. Looking back on that dinner, on the moment Veronica had sneered about my safe little office work, I recognized it as a profound turning point. Not just because of the dramatic revelation that followed, but because it finally forced everyone to confront truths they'd been avoiding. Trevor saw who Veronica really was beneath the charming exterior. My parents recognized their role in enabling destructive patterns. And I, perhaps most importantly, gained confirmation that I didn't need family approval to know my own worth. The pin I wore represented years of difficult, dangerous work done largely in silence. It represented operations I'd never be able to discuss, lives saved through intelligence I'd helped provide, and personal sacrifices that would remain invisible to everyone except those who had served alongside me. Veronica's inability to see value in work that didn't announce itself loudly said more about her limitations than mine. Her desperate need to diminish others to elevate herself revealed deep insecurity, not genuine superiority. I didn't need vindication from that dinner, though watching her face when Trevor corrected her assumptions had admittedly been satisfying. What mattered more was the clarity that came afterward, the understanding that I'd been measuring my worth against someone whose judgment had always been fundamentally flawed. My work had mattered. My service had made a profound difference. The fact that I couldn't broadcast those accomplishments, couldn't wear them as badges of honor in family conversations, didn't diminish their importance one iota. Years later, I still occasionally see Veronica at family gatherings. She's civil now, having learned that our parents will no longer tolerate open hostility. But the warmth between sisters, the genuine affection some siblings share, will never exist for us. Too much damage has been done. Too many years were spent with her trying to diminish me, and me learning not to care about her opinion. Sometimes people ask if I regret the way things turned out with my sister. The honest answer is no. I regret that we never had the relationship siblings are supposed to have. I regret that our parents' choices created such dysfunction. But I don't regret the boundaries I established, or the self-respect I maintained in the face of her contempt. That dinner taught me something invaluable. The truth eventually surfaces, regardless of how carefully it's concealed. Veronica's mask slipped in front of someone who could recognize what lay beneath it. And once Trevor saw clearly, once my parents finally paid attention, the careful fiction Veronica had constructed about our family collapsed. I didn't orchestrate that collapse. I simply existed honestly, doing work I believed in, wearing a small pin that represented service most people would never understand. Everything else followed from Veronica's choices, not mine. Sometimes, justice isn't about revenge or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, it's simply about truth being recognized and valued by people who matter. That dinner gave me that recognition, not because I demanded it, but because circumstances finally revealed what had always been.